The relationship between General Dwight D. Eisenhower and General George S. Patton Jr. was one of the most complex and consequential command relationships of World War II. On the surface, it appeared straightforward. Eisenhower was Supreme Allied Commander, responsible for overall strategy and coalition management. Patton was one of his most brilliant field commanders, a tactical genius whose aggressive leadership produced spectacular results on the battlefield. But beneath this professional hierarchy lay a complicated friendship dating back decades, a relationship tested repeatedly by Patton's insubordination, recklessness, and inability to follow orders he disagreed with. Throughout the war, Patton defied Eisenhower's orders multiple times, each instance forcing Eisenhower to decide between maintaining discipline and exploiting Patton's undeniable military talents. What Eisenhower said behind closed doors after these incidents of defiance reveals much about leadership, about the challenges of managing brilliant but difficult subordinates, and about the personal costs of command. This is the story of those private moments when Eisenhower, away from the cameras and the official record, grappled with what to do about his most talented and most troublesome general. The friendship between Eisenhower and Patton stretched back to the years after World War I, when both were young officers stationed at Fort Meade, Maryland. They had bonded over their shared interest in tanks and armored warfare at a time when such ideas were considered radical in the American Army. They had maintained contact through the interwar years as their careers progressed along different paths. Eisenhower became known as a staff officer, brilliant at organization and planning. Patton cultivated an image as a warrior, a cavalryman in the old tradition who believed in aggressive action and personal courage. When America entered World War II, Eisenhower rose rapidly through staff positions to eventually command all Allied forces in Europe. Patton commanded armored units in North Africa, Sicily, and eventually the Third Army in the drive across France and into Germany. This long personal history meant that Eisenhower's relationship with Patton was never purely professional. They were friends, or had been once. Eisenhower knew Patton's virtues and his flaws intimately. He knew that Patton was a brilliant tactical commander, perhaps the best the American Army had. He also knew that Patton was vain, impulsive, politically tone-deaf, and prone to insubordination when he disagreed with orders. Throughout the war, Eisenhower would be forced to balance his personal knowledge of Patton against his responsibilities as Supreme Commander, to decide when Patton's defiance could be overlooked and when it required discipline. The first major incident that tested this relationship occurred in August 1943 during the Sicily campaign. Patton, commanding the 7th Army alongside British forces under Montgomery, visited field hospitals to see wounded soldiers. At 2 different hospitals on different days, Patton encountered soldiers suffering from what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder, but what was then called battle fatigue or shell shock. Patton, who believed that such psychological casualties were cowards who were malingering, became enraged. He slapped both soldiers, called them cowards, and threatened to have them shot. He accused them of faking their symptoms to avoid combat. News of these slapping incidents reached Eisenhower within days. Medical personnel who witnessed the events were outraged and reported them through channels. Eisenhower was faced with an impossible situation. Patton had just successfully commanded American forces in their first major European campaign. His aggressive leadership had been instrumental in capturing Sicily, but he had also physically assaulted soldiers under his command, a serious violation of military law and basic human decency. If the incidents became public, there would be calls for Patton's court-martial and removal from command. What Eisenhower said and did behind closed doors during this crisis reveals his approach to managing Patton. According to accounts from Eisenhower's staff and from Eisenhower's own later statements, he was furious with Patton. In private conversations with his chief of staff, Walter Bedell Smith, and with other close advisors, Eisenhower expressed his anger and frustration. He reportedly said that Patton was a brilliant soldier, but also a goddamn fool, who seemed determined to destroy his own career. He acknowledged that Patton's behavior was inexcusable and that any other general would be relieved of command immediately. However, Eisenhower also recognized that Patton was too valuable to lose. The invasion of France was being planned, and Eisenhower believed that Patton's aggressive style would be crucial for breaking out of the Normandy beachhead once the landings succeeded. He told his staff that he needed Patton for the battles ahead, that no other American general had Patton's combination of tactical skill, aggressive instinct, and ability to inspire soldiers. The question was how to discipline Patton without destroying him, how to keep the incidents from becoming public, while still making clear that such behavior was unacceptable. Eisenhower's solution was to force Patton to apologize personally to the soldiers he had slapped, to the medical personnel who witnessed the incidents, and to the divisions under his command. Eisenhower wrote Patton a severe letter of reprimand, making clear that his conduct had been inexcusable and warning that any similar incident would result in his immediate relief from command. But Eisenhower also worked to keep the incidents from becoming public, believing that public knowledge would force his hand and require Patton's removal. In private conversations during this period, Eisenhower expressed a view of Patton that would characterize his thinking throughout the war. He told confidants that Patton was like a fine racehorse, bred for speed and courage but high-strung and difficult to manage. He said that managing Patton required constant attention, that you couldn't simply give him orders and expect compliance, that you had to watch him constantly and be prepared to rein him in when necessary. He compared commanding Patton to riding a powerful horse that might bolt at any moment, requiring a firm hand, but also recognition that the horse's power and speed were assets worth the trouble of management. Eisenhower's attempt to keep the slapping incidents quiet ultimately failed. In November 1943, months after the events, journalist Drew Pearson broke the story in a radio broadcast. The public reaction was immediate and severe. Many Americans were outraged that a general had assaulted soldiers suffering from combat stress. Newspapers called for Patton's court-martial. Members of Congress demanded his removal. Eisenhower faced enormous pressure to fire Patton, and many expected him to do so. Behind closed doors, Eisenhower was again confronted with the choice between discipline and military effectiveness. According to accounts from his staff, Eisenhower seriously considered relieving Patton during this period. He recognized that public opinion demanded some response, but he also remained convinced that Patton would be crucial for the coming invasion of France. In meetings with his senior commanders and with General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, Eisenhower argued that Patton should be retained despite his misconduct. He acknowledged that Patton's behavior had been wrong but insisted that Patton's military talents were irreplaceable. Marshall, speaking for the War Department and ultimately for President Roosevelt, left the decision to Eisenhower. If Eisenhower believed Patton was essential for military success, Marshall would support keeping him despite the political controversy. Eisenhower made the decision to retain Patton, though he sidelined him temporarily, keeping him out of the initial Normandy invasion and using him as a decoy to make the Germans believe the invasion would come at Calais rather than Normandy. Patton would not see combat again until July 1944, nearly a year after the slapping incidents. The decision to retain Patton despite the slapping scandal was controversial at the time and remains debated by historians. Eisenhower's private justification was purely pragmatic. He needed Patton's abilities for the battles ahead, and personal considerations or public opinion could not be allowed to override military necessity. However, this decision established a pattern that would repeat throughout the war. Patton would defy orders or create scandals. Eisenhower would be forced to discipline him, and ultimately Eisenhower would decide that Patton was too valuable to lose. The next major incident of Patton defying Eisenhower's orders occurred during the race across France in the summer of 1944. After breaking out of Normandy, Patton's Third Army conducted one of the most spectacular advances in military history, covering hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks and liberating much of France from German occupation. However, this advance was conducted on a logistical shoestring. Supply lines were stretched thin, fuel was scarce, and Eisenhower's strategy called for a broad front approach that would not allow any single army to advance too far ahead of others. Eisenhower issued orders limiting Patton's advance and directing that available fuel and supplies be allocated to Montgomery's forces in the north, which were conducting Operation Market Garden. Patton believed this was a strategic mistake, that his army could continue its advance deep into Germany if given adequate supplies, and that halting his momentum to support Montgomery was throwing away a golden opportunity. Rather than simply accept these orders, Patton engaged in what can only be called deliberate disobedience. Patton found creative ways to interpret his orders in the most permissive way possible. When told to halt on the Meuse River, he sent patrols across, then claimed he needed to reinforce them. When told to limit his fuel consumption, he claimed that units already in motion required fuel to reach their objectives. He made requests for supplies that were technically within regulations, but that he knew were stretching his authority. He appealed directly to Bradley, his immediate superior, to overrule or modify Eisenhower's directives. In effect, Patton was following the letter of his orders while violating their spirit, pushing as far forward as he could, while maintaining plausible deniability about insubordination. Eisenhower was well aware of what Patton was doing. In private conversations with his staff, Eisenhower expressed frustration and admiration in roughly equal measure. He reportedly said that Patton was impossible to control, but also that Patton's aggressive instincts were exactly what was needed to keep pressure on the retreating Germans. He acknowledged that Patton was technically disobeying orders, but noted that Patton's insubordination was producing military results. The question was whether to crack down on Patton and enforce strict obedience, which might slow the advance, or to tolerate his creative interpretation of orders and accept that managing Patton meant accepting a certain level of independence. In one conversation with Bradley recorded in memoirs and after-action reports, Eisenhower said something to the effect that giving Patton an order was like giving a suggestion to a force of nature. You could point Patton in a general direction and hope he would go roughly where you wanted, but you couldn't expect precise obedience. This was the price of Patton's genius, his inability to function within normal command relationships. Eisenhower accepted this price because Patton's results justified the management headaches he created. However, Eisenhower also made clear in private that there were limits to his tolerance. When Patton's defiance became too blatant, when he crossed the line from creative interpretation to outright disobedience, Eisenhower would pull him back sharply. In September 1944, when Patton's supply requisitions became too aggressive and threatened to disrupt the broader supply allocation plan, Eisenhower called Patton to his headquarters and delivered a severe dressing down. According to witnesses, Eisenhower told Patton that he was tired of his insubordination, that orders were orders regardless of whether Patton agreed with them, and that the next incident would result in Patton's relief from command. These confrontations between Eisenhower and Patton were described by staff officers who witnessed them as intense and personal. Eisenhower, normally calm and diplomatic, would become angry and would speak to Patton with a bluntness he rarely used with other commanders. Patton, who could be arrogant and dismissive with most superiors, generally accepted Eisenhower's rebukes without argument. The personal history between them meant that Eisenhower could speak to Patton in ways that other commanders could not, and that Patton would accept criticism from Eisenhower that he would reject from others. After these confrontations, Eisenhower would often speak with his staff about the difficulties of managing Patton. He expressed frustration that he had to spend so much time and energy managing one subordinate when he had an entire theater to command. He noted that Patton's brilliance came packaged with impossible personality traits and constant disciplinary problems. But he also consistently came back to the conclusion that Patton was worth the trouble, that the results he produced justified the management challenges. Another major incident occurred in late 1944 and early 1945, related to Patton's crossing of the Rhine River. Eisenhower had designated Montgomery to conduct the primary Rhine crossing operation, called Operation Plunder, which was planned meticulously over months with enormous resources allocated to ensure success. However, in late March 1945, before Montgomery's operation could be launched, Patton found a crossing opportunity at Oppenheim and seized it. He crossed the Rhine with minimal preparation, achieved complete surprise, and established a bridgehead on the eastern bank with minimal casualties. He then deliberately waited to inform Eisenhower until the crossing was accomplished, presenting his commander with a fait accompli. When Eisenhower learned of Patton's crossing, his reaction behind closed doors was reportedly mixed. On one hand, he was angry that Patton had once again acted independently without proper authorization. On the other hand, he recognized that Patton had achieved a significant military success that complicated German defenses and took some pressure off Montgomery's operation. In conversations with his staff, Eisenhower reportedly said that Patton had done it again, simultaneously expressing exasperation and acknowledgement of Patton's achievement. The Rhine crossing incident created political complications because Montgomery had been preparing his operation for months and had expected to conduct the first Allied crossing. When Patton beat him across by several days, Montgomery was furious and believed that Patton had deliberately upstaged him. Eisenhower found himself mediating between his British and American subordinates, while also dealing with Patton's insubordination. In private, Eisenhower expressed frustration that Patton's ego and his need for glory created political problems within the Allied coalition that Eisenhower then had to solve. However, Eisenhower also recognized that Patton's crossing had been brilliantly executed and militarily valuable. In conversations with Marshall and with other American commanders, Eisenhower praised Patton's tactical skill while criticizing his failure to coordinate properly. He defended Patton against British criticism while privately reprimanding Patton for creating unnecessary political complications. Once again, Eisenhower was balancing Patton's military value against his disruptive behavior, trying to harness his talents while limiting the damage his personality caused. The final months of the war in Europe brought a new series of incidents involving Patton's defiance of orders, this time related to Soviet forces. As American and Soviet armies converged on Germany from opposite directions, Eisenhower issued clear orders about coordination with Soviet forces and about respecting agreed-upon occupation zones. Patton, who was deeply anti-communist and who believed that the Soviet Union would be America's next enemy, repeatedly pushed the boundaries of these orders. He wanted to advance as far east as possible, to capture as much German territory as he could before Soviet forces arrived, and to establish American positions that could be used as leverage in post-war negotiations. Eisenhower was sympathetic to some of Patton's concerns about Soviet intentions, but recognized that political considerations required cooperation with the Soviets as allies. In private conversations during this period, Eisenhower expressed frustration that Patton could not separate his personal political views from his military responsibilities. He told staff members that Patton was brilliant at tactical operations, but completely incompetent at strategic thinking, unable to understand the political dimensions of coalition warfare. He said that Patton's anti-Soviet statements and his aggressive posture toward Soviet forces created diplomatic problems that threatened the alliance at a crucial moment. When Patton advocated for attacking the Soviet Union, Eisenhower's private reaction was one of anger and disbelief. According to accounts from staff officers, Eisenhower told Patton in no uncertain terms that such ideas were not only militarily foolish, but also politically insane. He made clear that Patton's job was to follow orders, not to formulate grand strategy or to advocate for policies that contradicted American government decisions. These confrontations during the final weeks of the war were among the most severe between Eisenhower and Patton, reflecting Eisenhower's recognition that Patton's usefulness was ending as the war transitioned from combat operations to occupation and political settlement. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, Patton's continued defiance of orders and his political statements became increasingly problematic. As military governor of Bavaria, Patton was supposed to implement denazification policies, removing former Nazis from positions of authority. Instead, Patton argued that these policies were impractical and that Germany needed to be rebuilt quickly as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. He made statements comparing Nazi Party membership to Republican or Democratic Party membership in the United States, suggesting it was politically irrelevant. These statements created a public scandal and put enormous pressure on Eisenhower to remove Patton from his position. Behind closed doors, Eisenhower's reaction to Patton's post-war behavior reflected deep disappointment and frustration. According to memoirs and accounts from staff officers, Eisenhower felt that Patton had learned nothing from previous incidents, that he remained incapable of understanding political realities or of moderating his statements for public consumption. Eisenhower reportedly told confidants that Patton was a great warrior, but a terrible peacetime leader, that his talents were suited for combat, but not for the complex tasks of occupation and reconstruction. In October 1945, Eisenhower made the decision to relieve Patton as military governor of Bavaria and to reassign him to command of the 15th Army, a largely paper organization. This was effectively a demotion and a clear signal that Patton's career was ending in disgrace. In private conversations explaining this decision, Eisenhower expressed sadness along with frustration. He acknowledged Patton's immense contributions to Allied victory. He recognized that Patton had been one of the most effective American commanders of the war. But he also concluded that Patton's inability to follow orders, to moderate his statements, and to adapt to changing circumstances made him unsuitable for command in the post-war environment. Eisenhower's private correspondence and diary entries from this period reveal a man struggling with conflicting emotions about Patton. He wrote that Patton was one of the best combat generals he had ever known, but also one of the most difficult personalities he had encountered. He expressed regret that Patton's career had to end this way, but insisted that he had no choice, that Patton's behavior had made his position untenable. He noted that he had protected Patton and covered for him repeatedly throughout the war, but that there were limits to what even friendship and past achievement could excuse. When Patton died in December 1945 from injuries sustained in a car accident, Eisenhower was reportedly devastated. Despite all the difficulties and frustrations, despite the constant management challenges and the repeated incidents of insubordination, Eisenhower had maintained affection and respect for Patton. In private conversations after Patton's death, Eisenhower spoke about their long friendship, about Patton's brilliance as a combat commander, and about his own regret that Patton's career had ended in disappointment rather than triumph. He acknowledged that managing Patton had been one of the most challenging aspects of his command, but insisted that it had been worth it, that Patton's contributions to victory justified every headache and every incident of defiance. Years later, after both men had become historical figures, Eisenhower would write and speak more publicly about his relationship with Patton. In his memoirs and in interviews, Eisenhower consistently portrayed Patton as a brilliant but difficult subordinate, someone whose military genius came packaged with serious character flaws. He defended his decision to retain Patton despite the slapping scandal and despite repeated incidents of insubordination. He argued that a commander's job was to win battles, and that sometimes winning required tolerating difficult personalities and managing brilliant but flawed subordinates. However, these public statements were more measured and diplomatic than what Eisenhower said behind closed doors during the war. The private Eisenhower, as revealed in staff accounts and in communications that were not intended for public consumption, was more blunt and more frustrated. He called Patton names, expressed exasperation at his behavior, and questioned whether Patton was worth the constant trouble. But even in these private moments of frustration, Eisenhower always came back to the same conclusion. Patton was too valuable to lose, His battlefield results justified the management challenges, and no other American general could do what Patton did. The relationship between Eisenhower and Patton offers lessons about leadership that remain relevant decades later. It demonstrates the challenges of managing brilliant but difficult subordinates, people whose talents are undeniable, but whose personalities create constant problems. It shows how leaders must balance discipline and results, must decide when to enforce rules strictly, and when to tolerate violations in pursuit of larger objectives. And it reveals the personal costs of command, how leaders must make difficult decisions about subordinates who are also friends, must balance personal loyalty against organizational needs, and must sometimes sacrifice relationships for the mission. What Eisenhower said behind closed doors after Patton defied his orders reveals a commander constantly wrestling with these challenges. He never found a perfect solution to managing Patton because no perfect solution existed. Patton's genius and his flaws were inseparable, two sides of the same personality. You couldn't have Patton's aggressive brilliance without his insubordination, couldn't have his inspiring leadership without his ego, couldn't have his battlefield success without his disruptive behavior. Eisenhower recognized this and made a calculated decision that Patton was worth the trouble, despite everything. In the final analysis, Eisenhower's private statements about Patton reflected a complex mixture of admiration, frustration, affection, and exasperation. He valued Patton's military talents enormously and believed that Patton's contributions were crucial to Allied victory. He was also constantly frustrated by Patton's inability to follow orders, by his political tone deafness, and by the endless management challenges he created. Behind closed doors, away from the need to maintain public images or official narratives, Eisenhower could express both of these perspectives simultaneously, could acknowledge that Patton was both invaluable and impossible. The story of what Eisenhower said about Patton behind closed doors is ultimately a story about the human dimensions of command. It reminds us that military leadership is not just about strategy and tactics, but also about managing personalities, about balancing competing demands, and about making difficult choices with imperfect information. Eisenhower's handling of Patton was not perfect. He arguably let Patton get away with too much, allowed personal friendship to influence professional judgment, and created a precedent that might have undermined discipline. But he also successfully harnessed one of the most talented and difficult commanders in American military history, contributing significantly to Allied victory in World War II. Whether this success justified the compromises Eisenhower made is a question that each observer must answer for themselves. But the complexity and difficulty of Eisenhower's position cannot be denied.